Welcome to the Pencil Bob channel. I hope you enjoy the story. Remember to like and subscribe. And now the story.
I never thought that something as mundane as trash cans would become the battleground for a clash of wills between me and the HOA, but here I am facing fines and threats of legal action, simply because I refused to use the designated trash cans provided by the association. It all started innocently enough. Like any responsible homeowner, I diligently read through the rules and regulations set forth by the Homeowners Association when I moved into the neighborhood. Amongst the sea of clauses and restrictions, one rule stood out: the requirement to use only the designated trash cans provided by the HOA. At first it seemed like a reasonable request. After all, the association claimed it would maintain the uniformity and aesthetic appeal of the neighborhood. But as time went on, I began to see the absurdity of it all. You see, the designated trash cans were these hideous, oversized monstrosities that clashed horribly with the exterior of my home. They were an eyesore, to say the least, and I couldn't bear the thought of having them sit prominently in front of my house for all to see. So, like any rational person, I decided to stick with my own trusty trash cans, the ones I'd been using for years without issue. They were simple, practical, and did the job just fine. Plus, they matched the aesthetic of my home perfectly. But apparently my defiance didn't sit well with the powers that be at the HOA. I started receiving notices, polite reminders at first, urging me to comply with the rules for the sake of community harmony. I ignored them, hoping they would eventually give up and move on to more pressing matters. But they didn't. Instead, the notices became more frequent and more threatening. Fines were imposed, hefty ones too, and I found myself embroiled in a bureaucratic nightmare of appeals and hearings. I couldn't believe it. All this fuss over a couple of trash cans? Wasn't there anything more important for the HOA to focus on? Apparently not. As the months went by, my frustration turned into outright rebellion. I refused to back down, determined to assert my independence in the face of this absurd overreach of authority. I began to document every interaction with the HOA, every letter, every email, every phone call. I meticulously researched the relevant laws and regulations, determined to find some loophole or technicality that would vindicate my stance. But the HOA was relentless. They seemed to have unlimited resources and a team of lawyers at their disposal, while I was just a lone homeowner fighting against the machine. Friends and neighbors urged me to give in, to avoid further trouble, and just comply with the rules like everyone else. But I couldn't bring myself to do it. It wasn't just about the trash cans anymore, it was about principle. It was about standing up for what I believed was right, even in the face of overwhelming opposition. And so the battle raged on. Months turned into years, and still neither side showed any sign of backing down. But then, just when it seemed like all hope was lost, a glimmer of light appeared on the horizon. A new member was elected to the HOA board. Someone sympathetic to my cause. Someone willing to challenge the status quo. With their support, I finally had a fighting chance. Together, we launched a campaign to reform the HOA's policies, to rein in their unchecked power, and restore some semblance of sanity to our community. It wasn't easy and it wasn't quick. But slowly, inch by inch, we began to make progress. The fines were dropped, the threats ceased, and eventually the rule about the designated trash cans was abolished altogether. In the end, I emerged victorious, not just for myself, but for every homeowner who had ever felt oppressed of the iron fist of the HOA. It was a hard-fought battle, but one that was worth fighting for. And as I wheel my trusty old trash cans out to the curb once again, I can't help but smile. Because sometimes even the most ordinary things can become symbols of something much greater. Symbols of freedom, of defiance, and of the enduring power of the human spirit. As a young homeowner with a penchant for innovation, the arrival of Mobot marked the beginning of what I hoped would be a new era in our neighborhood. You see, I've always been fascinated by technology and its potential to make our lives easier. So when I stumbled upon Mobot, a robotic lawnmower, I knew I had to bring it into our community.
Excited by the prospect of saying goodbye to sweaty afternoons spent pushing a traditional lawnmower, I eagerly introduced Mobot to the neighborhood.
But instead of the enthusiastic reception I had anticipated, I was met with skepticism and resistance, particularly from the Homeowners Association.
From the moment Mobot's sleek, futuristic design glided onto the scene, it seemed as though the HOA had instantly classified it as a safety hazard.
Their concerns soared, echoing worries of potential accidents and property damage, despite my earnest assurances of its benign nature falling on deaf ears.
Initially, I brushed off their apprehensions, convinced that once they saw Mobot in action, they would come around.
But as days turned into weeks, it became apparent that convincing the HOA wouldn't be as simple as I had hoped.
Undeterred, I decided to take matters into my own hands. I reached out to my fellow homeowners, explaining the benefits of Mobot and highlighting its potential to revolutionize lawn care in our community.
To my delight, many of my neighbors shared my enthusiasm for innovation. They were tired of the same old routines and were eager to embrace new technologies that could make their lives easier. With their support, I launched a campaign to prove Mobot's worth and advocate for a more progressive stance on technology within our neighborhood.
Despite our tireless endeavors, the HOA stood firm in their resolve. Their unwavering stance persisted, anchored by concerns of liability and a commitment to strict regulations. As the dispute lingered, divisions deepened within our neighborhood. Friendships strained under the weight of disagreement, and what was once a harmonious community now found itself fractured by the contentious issue of Mobot. Desperate to find a resolution, I decided to appeal directly to the HOA president.
Surely, I thought, if I could just reason with him one-on-one, he would see the sense in allowing Mobot to stay.
Unfortunately, my efforts were in vain. The HOA president remained unmoved, his allegiance to the association's rules unwavering.
It seemed that no amount of logic or persuasion could sway him from his position. Defeated and disillusioned, I found myself faced with a heartbreaking decision.
Reluctantly, I realized that if I wanted to maintain peace within the neighborhood, I would have to comply with the HOA's demands. With a heavy heart, I dismantled Mobot, watching as its bustling mechanisms fell silent.
As I returned to the drudgery of manual lawn care, I couldn't help but feel a sense of bitterness and regret. It wasn't just about losing Mobot, it was about losing something much more significant. It was about losing our collective hope for a brighter, more inclusive future.
The entire ordeal served as a stark reminder of the power dynamics at play within our community.
It was a sobering realization that even in the face of progress and innovation, bureaucratic conformity could still reign supreme. As I watched my neighbors carry on with their lives resigned to the status quo, I couldn't shake the feeling that something precious had been lost. The spirit of innovation had been crushed, and the potential for progress had been stifled by fear and narrow-mindedness. As the hum of gas-powered lawnmowers once again filled the air, I couldn't help but wonder what other innovations would fall victim to the same fate. How many more opportunities for positive change would be sacrificed on the altar of conformity and tradition?
In the end, the Mobot saga served as a powerful reminder of the challenges that often accompany progress.
It underscored the reality that innovation can face resistance even in the face of promising advancements. However, despite the setbacks encountered, my optimism remained unwavering.
I held on to the belief that our community would eventually come to embrace change.
I continued to envision a future where innovation thrived, unrestricted by anything other than the limits of our imagination. This is a long story, well in time anyways, and I don't even know where to begin with it. 2 years ago, my husband helped a lot of people in our neighborhood with some basic handyman repairs. That's the type of guy he is.
One of the neighbors he helped out was our HOA president. She started begging him to join the board.
January rolls around, he gets voted on.
Over the past year, he's made it his mission to talk to neighbors to resolve issues, often preemptively, rather than having the property management company send letters.
As an example, there was a family that kept getting fines because they filled out their ARC form incorrectly.
English wasn't their native language, and he sat down and helped them fill it out correctly.
The HOA president had went on a racist rant about them, and I don't think she would have been satisfied with anything less than making them tear down their addition. Around the time summer rolled around and my husband put together a community cookout, she saw how popular he was with neighbors. And she started to feel threatened.
She began making decisions for the neighborhood without consulting with the board. At the same time, she and her buddy start making a huge deal about our yard. Our house was a rental for 10+ years, and the owner neglected all routine maintenance.
The yard is about 80% weeds.
Before we moved into rent, we asked for something to be done about the yard. Nothing was done.
While we were renting, we asked the property management company to force the owner to comply. They wouldn't do anything.
When we bought the house, the first thing we did was contract with a weed control service. It's still a problem, but we have plans for our yard. They just don't happen on Karen's schedule. A guy made it known that he intended to vote my husband in as president. The president's BFF resigns because she refuses to be on a board with a president that doesn't follow the rules. Tonight was their first meeting of the year. The president refused to allow the board to vote on members.
The kicker is that our HOA covenants are actually quite lenient compared to many communities you read about here. Our lawn is perfectly fine, and we've never been fined over our lawn. Quick backstory: about 40 years ago, and before my time, easement holders and the local HOA got into a very expensive lawsuit that was about to go off the rails.
It was super petty too. Easement holders and HOA families telling their kids not to play with each other.
HOA then added locks to different areas for security and issued keys to both member and easement holders, then randomly changing the locks without issuing new keys to the easement holders.
Easement holders pushing the boundary of what the easement allowed. Stuff like that?
And when the bills for the lawyers came back and how expensive it was getting, the two opposing parties came to a compromise.
Easement holders pay the basic upkeep fees. The HOA allow easement holders to partake in HOA events. For every 5 boat slips available, easement holders got 2, and both sides back off the petty stuff. This was written out, but never signed by both parties.
And everything was fine for almost 40 freaking years. Little spats here and there, but nothing too outrageous. Recently, the HOA board members that struck the deal have resigned for one reason or another.
Death being the most common reason. Newer board members came in and started changing things up. They started enforcing obscure rules that haven't been enforced in years and making up new ones. One of the new ones was that easement holders were no longer allowed at board meetings unless the easement holders were specifically on the agenda. And since most HOA members were friendly with easement holder families, the board decided that certain board meetings were to be board members only.
And you guessed it, most meetings were now special sessions. And now the original unsigned agreement has been ignored, and a new one was written that easement holders had to abide by all of the HOA regulations or lose privileges.
Enter George. George was a city boy who dove deep into country-style living, even though the area was now considered a suburb.
Moved out there full-time and decided to really improve his property.
George added a very nice barn-style shed for his stuff. He got several violation notices in the mail about how it wasn't an approved style shed, and the color was not an approved color, even though the color matched his house. George has money and he paid for a lawyer to get involved to remind them that he is not a part of the HOA. George gets another violation.
Accusations of keeping farm animals in the barn, and they were causing a nuisance.
Lawyer gets involved again, and this time informs the HOA that the area is partially zoned for certain livestock. George now proceeds to get a couple chickens and a goat.
Cops are called this time on a tip that George had a rooster, and they are not zoned for them.
While George did have a rooster, local laws say he is allowed just one.
He countersues for harassment and wins. He gets another violation.
This time about his dogs. George regularly brought his dogs to beach.
He wasn't the only one, as most people in the area did, and would regularly bring them down to swim and exercise.
Even other board members. George was informed that he lost his boat slip for repeated violations of various rules. Didn't matter that anyone else was doing the same.
Considering what the HOA insurance policy said about the beach, after 5 feet of depth, the swimming area was supposed to be off limits.
Just so happens that there is a floating dock that used to be for the swimming area, but now not because of said insurance policy. That is where he decides to put it. Back to court they go. The issue is currently unresolved. But as bills and fees went out in January, like they usually do, there was a special assessment fee added for the easement holders. Comparing the bills with a friendly HOA member, they did not get the same fee. Looks like they are trying to get the easement holders to pay for the bills George is causing because George has deep pockets. The HOA has come out before saying that if they dissolved and sold to the town, that any easement holder's claim on the property gets super diluted to point it is worthless.
Not sure if this is an empty threat or something else.
Some of the easement holders and boat-owning HOA members have been trying to get an estimate from the board on how much it would be to buy out the beaches.
The HOA board just responds with that the easement holders can't afford their asking price, even though they haven't given a price.
I would like to thank you for watching the video to the end. To encourage us to make more videos, please like, subscribe, comment, as well as share. Check out this other video if you haven't already.